Well, I guess I'll get us kicked off here. That we may have a few extra folks roll in as we get started. You may have been prompted with a poll as you go in. There's a possibility we'll pop up another one here. But we want to get a sense of sort of how well people are familiar with MCC. So I'm going to see if we can get in the next 30 seconds or hear any survey information to pop up. But there are wrong answers. Usually surveys, of this kind are polite, and there are not wrong answers. Here you will be docked for incorrect answers. No, I'm kidding. So let's see if I go to the next slide here. Let's see, I think there we go. So we got a couple responses. So we've got some folks with a vague notion, some who didn't answer the survey, surely, and some who did confuse us with the Millennium Falcon. So we are the Millennium Challenge Corporation, for those who are not familiar. We're a US federal government agency whose mission is to reduce poverty through economic growth. We're here with Mathematica researchers who will be presenting on a piece of their study. I'll let them introduce themselves since we'll each be presenting along the way. But as far as the Millennium Challenge Corporation goes, we're a sort of unique development agency focused on reducing poverty through economic growth, like I said, and selectivity is at the heart of our approach. So we use a scorecard of publicly available indicators as part of our selection process of the country partners we're going to work with. Indicators on ruling justly, promoting economic freedom, and investing in their people. Our approach is really to focus on results using, among other tools, cost-benefit analysis to ensure that we meet a threshold economic rate of return for each of our projects to make sure that we're being effective with taxpayer resources. We have a strict 5-year time clock on our implementation, and importantly, we're all about country ownership at the heart of what we do. So we have our partner countries both develop as well as implement the investments, the grant funding that we implement. Briefly, we work currently in about 24 countries. I think that we may have one additional or two that are not on this slide since last year when we made this slide. But we're across the whole world with obviously a huge focus in Africa. Our investments, just to give a quick sense, are really focused on alleviating the constraints to inclusive economic growth. We do an analysis up front of every country partnership that we form. And then we work with the countries to develop a package of investments to address everything from sort of policy reform, institutional constraints, as well as infrastructure constraints, social constraints. So you'll see across our portfolio there in that pie chart that we really do work across quite a few sectors, though I think infrastructure is sort of what we're sort of most known for. We do work across a lot of other sectors. Something that sort of stands out, I actually didn't introduce myself. My name is Ryan Moore. I'm a director of evaluation. So that's sort of where I come from. And we do an independent evaluation of every project. And one of the unique pieces of what we do is that often, and most of the time, in fact, those evaluations are completed 3, 4, 5, and even more, as many as 10 years in some cases after the end of a program, meaning that we can really ensure that we're detecting, measuring that end line at the right moment in time, and that it's independent teams of researchers. So briefly, this presentation is about a paper that Marcel Ricou and I co-authored for MCC, a sort of flagship paper on technical and vocational education and training. And the sort of at the heart of that paper is this question of why is MCC investing in this sector? What's the logic? And have we achieved to date what we set out to achieve? And so sort of starting from first principles, if we're focused on alleviating constraints to inclusive economic growth, what are we trying to do to achieve that? And what we're really finding in countries where we choose to invest with our partner countries in TVET, as it's called, or workforce development, we find that the private sector really is lacking the access to a skilled workforce that it can use to grow and compete, and that really is holding back growth in the economy. I talked about evaluation briefly. You'll see in this slide, it's a little bit busy, but this timeline will show you up top, the darker blue boxes are a first generation of TVET investments that MCC has made, ending in around 2013, 2014. And because we make sure that we measure the effects of our evaluation, our programs after the programs are fully completed and giving enough time to see the impacts of those, what we found is that, even though there was a decent gap between that first generation of investments and what we call this second generation down below, the lighter blue boxes, you're still sort of getting those evaluations coming as you're implementing a new programming. And so that process of iterative learning is really what this paper was about, was both, okay, we finished a package of fairly large investments in this space. What did we get? How can we incorporate that into our programs that are still in the field? And then, what does that look like for our agency going forward? And then one of the paper that our colleagues from Mathematical will be presenting is actually one of those gray boxes down below from Georgia. So what did we invest in across this first generation that we're going to look at? We invested across those three countries are the ones we talk about most in the paper, which is Namibia, Mongolia, and El Salvador, for those who aren't sort of obsessive about maps or flags like I am. But we look at programs that are formal secondary programs in some cases, some non-formal programs, as well as some post-secondary, but mostly in that sort of formal secondary and some non-formal programming. We invested in new and rehabbed infrastructure, sort of new equipment for these TVET programs, a number of technical assistance pieces to sort of build on those programs, build on putting out better curriculum, ensuring training of the folks who are doing the training in these TVET centers. And then even some pretty substantial policy reform, but everything from sort of building blocks of a competency-based approach to more substantial reforms and reorganizations in some cases. But as we dug into, okay, what did we achieve? What can we learn from it? We started with, did we, first of all, just finish our programs? Did we complete the things we were supposed to complete? And the reality is that we did achieve quite a lot. As you'll see on these numbers, but 138,000 students having participated in TVET programs that MCC has invested in. You'll see that across these three programs, they all have pretty reasonable objectives, slightly different, tailored to each context. But we looked into, were these objectives set out in a smart way? And we found that largely, yes. Quality of TVET, is it relevant to employers? Are we alleviating skill constraints that employers are finding? So sort of going back to those first principles, yes, we're achieving. We're sort of setting out objectives that made sense, but then did we actually achieve those objectives was sort of the bigger question. This was one evaluation from Namibia that sort of we found to be fairly representative of our broader findings across that first generation. 85% of the enrollees in this program is called a COSTECH program. In Namibia, we're completing their training, not a unreasonable number. 40% of those enrollees reported being employed 1 year after training. So that's, I think, certainly not a great number, but it could just mean, I guess you're working with a very, very tough population. But I think the thing that sort of stood out to us, and that slide got a little wonky there, it looks like, but enrollees, only 13% of enrollees reported being employed in the field of training. I think that's something that, that number sort of speaks for itself, that if we hope that these programs, these investments are going to sort of alleviate skills constraints, there should be something that's indicating us that there was actually a gap there that this program was helping to fill. Perhaps encouragingly, but a bit shockingly, perhaps for some, we're not alone in sort of not seeing really encouraging results in this TVET space in workforce development. Depending on who you're reading in the literature, but generally it's found that around 2/3 of evaluations of TVET programs fail to show jobs and income impacts. And then many of those that even do show jobs and income impact, can't even pass a simple cost benefit test of, was the benefit that this program delivered as big as the cost that was spent on it? But as you dig into, the World Bank's 2018 World Development Report, as well as some other literature, it does seem clear that there are conditions under which TVET programs really can be responsive to the constraints to economic growth and sort of fulfilling this promise of employment for job seekers. And so we dug in and tried to see, what is a model that might be more responsive? And so the paper, and I'm going to hand it off to my colleague in a minute, uses a 2004 World Development Report that was called Making Services Work for the Poor as sort of a framework under which to understand this, where we're at. And so, that framework lays out, right, what you can see on the screen here. This is called the short route of accountability. So, in a traditional sort of market good, you would expect, providers, whether it be a sandwich seller or a dry cleaner, to be directly responsive to their client via that client's power to say, I will or I won't come back and frequent your service. But in a sort of public or somewhat public service, that generally can be either weakened, or that client power over a provider doesn't exist at all. The provider doesn't see sort of citizens or the poor in particular as a client base for them. And so adapting that model into TVET in particular, that sort of client power, like we said, would be job seekers' ability to have power over TVET providers, client power, to be able to have that be directly responsive to them. And we see that, anyone who's worked in this space knows that that's generally not the case in most systems for lots of very good reasons. But that longer route across the top is, where we see, in theory, policymakers should be accountable to the voice of those job seekers as citizens. And TVET providers, in theory, should in tandem be responsive to policymakers. That's what's called the long route of accountability. So the paper sort of walks through these two, the short route at the bottom for client power and the long route across the top as two sort of channels to have service providers in this space be accountable to citizens, to the poor, in this case, to job seekers. But what we found as we sort of thought through this model, this sort of classical model of accountability and service delivery, is that there's this huge other client that's sort of missing from how one would think about that, which is employers. A TVET provider is a service being provided to the citizens of a country, yet without the employers being brought in as an additional stakeholder here, we're sort of missing a big piece of the story. And so whether that be through understanding how their demand feeds into the TVET provider's provision, whether that be job seekers understanding, at the end of this training, are there employers who are actually in demand of that skill that I'm getting? And will I get sufficient skills out of this training to be employable with that set of providers? So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Marcel, who's going to unpack sort of what does this sort of theoretical framework mean for how we want to design our investments and evaluate our crop of investments. Over to you, Marcel.
Thanks, Ryan. Morning, everyone. My name is Marcel Riku. I'm an associate director in MCC's Human and Community Development Practice Group, and I was a co-author of the paper with Ryan. And we want to, take what Ryan's done and kind of build this out into a results framework. So all this literature, and then our experience. So what is it that should be driving TVET? I like to start at the right, so that we all have in mind, where we're building to. And so that's this dual.
Looks like we've lost Marcel. I don't know, Ira, Ivan, can you nod if, oh yeah, it looks like you're back, Marcel.
Oh, sorry. So click Ryan, please. Or yep. Where did I miss?
You were just right here.
Okay. Yeah, so these are the two goals we're building to. So building from the left, there's within a skills development system, you have trainee entrants that come in with baggage, good or bad. So prior learning and skills, perceptions of whether or not TVET is a good thing or bad thing, willingness and ability to pay. And then you have training inputs where, I won't read this whole list, but facilities, equipment, trainers, curricula, career counseling, all of this goes together. And this is where we draw on the World Bank's overall sub-AIR framework as well as the TVET specific one. And they bring out this concept of like there's this black box of governance, and all these things go into a black box of governance, and then outputs come out the other side. And what we try to do in our paper is unpack that black box. The next, right? And so when we do that, it's let's start with this core central box. You have a national system and service delivery. Now, this core part could really be any service delivery system. It could be general education. It could be higher education. And this is, you have a national system that has data and information, that provides financing, that has quality assurance frameworks. And you have a service delivery level where autonomy and accountability are really important. And that is to making sure they deliver and kind of provide that service. What's really important in TVET is these two outer boxes and the bigger blue box, which is that the national system needs to constantly be in touch with and adapting to national labor market demand information. And at the service delivery level, there need to be links with employers that need to be channeling local demand information and skills needs to service provision so that can continuously adapt to meet those needs. This kind of overall system then through this governance function puts out a quantity and quality of training. Click Ryan, please. Which provides skills and ultimately jobs and impacts for individuals. Click Ryan, please. And productivity and competitiveness for firms. Importantly, there's feedback loops that need to go back in to the system, right? So at the national level, this long route of accountability, in order for the national system to be able to do its function of managing the system, to provide quality assurance service delivery, you need feedback on jobs and income, on national labor market demand, to be able to do that job. It also, you need this short route feedback from firms and employers on what their local demand is, what their needs are to service provision to be able to make that function. Next slide. So real quick, some of the stylized takeaways from our first generation of programs, and then we'll map these on to that results framework and see how we did, and then where there are gaps that we should be looking to in the future. The first is dynamic, you need to have a sense of what the dynamic labor market needs are. And that's not just a one-off study, but that's being able to look to evaluate over time and get that information over time. Another important thing is that if you just do more of the status quo through existing governance and existing service delivery, you'll just get more of the same weak results. And we saw that in some of our programs. Hands-on practical learning is key. The one positive thing that came out of the non-formal El Salvador evaluation was this, that like where it was really hands-on and linked to needs, there were some positive results out of that. we need to address gender disparities in both recruitment and outcomes, and we saw across our programs kind of weaker results for women than for men. And finally, we need to judge success by hard data and feed that analysis back into governance. So the system needs that information. So taking these and looking back at our results framework, we'll see how we did. So first off, we kind of really were able to provide inputs, right? We built facilities, we provided curriculum, bought equipment. Next, at the national system level, we did some of this. So there's an interesting reform that we supported in Mongolia that where they kind of really took a private sector oriented approach. They created a national council, an agency for TVET that was kind of more independent, that took into account that private sector perspective. I think the council even had a majority private sector representation on its board or council. But after one government, it got rolled back. At the service delivery level, we found that we really didn't do anything to improve the governance of service delivery. In terms of outputs, we got, those, as you saw earlier from Ryan's slide, a large degree of quantity of training. In terms of quality, our evaluations asked some questions about quality, and there were some perceptions of good quality, but unclear how much that reflected kind of reality in the actual quality of training. At the results or outcomes level, we saw very limited impact on jobs and income. And interestingly, we didn't even ask the question of whether or not employers were getting what they needed, whether or not they were seeing productivity. Click right. And so just to wrap this up, I think we draw a link between the two red. Oh, sorry, go back one. We draw a link between these two red boxes that we really didn't do anything at the service delivery level to improve that governance, to get better outcomes, and that is a determinant of the fact that we got limited jobs outcomes. And going forward, we really need to pay more attention to those. So now I'll turn it over to my colleagues from Mathematica, who will take a look at some hot off the press results out of Georgia, and then we'll be back later to talk about our overall lessons.
Great, thanks, Marcel. Hi, my name is Ira Nichols-Bear. I'm a principal researcher at Mathematica, and together with my colleague Evan Borkham, we'll be sharing preliminary results from our evaluation of MCC's TVET investments in Georgia. So Mathematica provides independent third-party research and evaluation services to support evidence-based programs and policies. And we do a lot of work in education and technical and vocational and higher education broadly. And Mathematica conducted 2 of these earlier evaluations of MCC's TVET investments in Namibia and El Salvador. We are currently working on this evaluation in Georgia and also ongoing evaluations in Morocco and Guatemala. And Mathematica has done similar work for other agencies, for USAID, the World Bank, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and others. So the information we'll be sharing here will be released in a public report later this year, but it's not available publicly yet. So this is a sneak peek of what we found from our evaluation. So let's see if I have control here. I'm not sure if I do. So
looks like you did. Yeah,
okay, great.
I just went there, yeah.
Great. So the TVET sector in Georgia has received a great deal of donor attention and reform over the past decade. And so some of the context here, this is a post-Soviet system where 10 or so years ago, the TVET sector did not have a lot of prestige in Georgia. It was viewed as definitely sort of a second-class track for higher education relative to the university system. But over the past 10 years, there's been a major effort to reform and change those perceptions, both amongst potential trainees and employers. And MCC's investment is very closely aligned with investments from other donors as well in this area to try to transform the TVET sector, make it more effective in providing training that's useful to employers, and change perceptions broadly in the society about the value of vocational education. And so the context of the program we evaluated in Georgia, this was a 5-year compact, so between 2014 and 2019. And the principal activity, there were other smaller activities, but the main focus of the investment in our evaluation were competitive grants So TVET providers applied to a local entity to propose new or enhanced TVET courses. And in total, there were about 50 courses that were created with these funds. And these covered a wide range of sectors. So when you're looking at the results, definitely think of this as like a grab bag of many different courses and many different vocations. But generally, they were all selected with the goal of meeting an unmet need from employers. And the fields include tourism, agriculture, and sort of engineering and science and technology fields. So some examples, and the picture here was an aviation course. There was railway operations and maintenance courses, port operations, and more general information technology courses. So a fairly wide range. And a requirement of these grants, and this definitely reflects those lessons Marcel was summarizing, a requirement of the grant was that there had to be substantial involvement and co-investment from a private sector partner, in addition to the investment from MCC. So this was built into the grant process, is that there had to be a major role. And as you can see, it was, the private sector contributions were worth about half the total dollar amount MCC invested. So this was a $12 million investment from MCC across these 10 providers, and private sector partners invested an additional $6 million in establishing these courses. So in terms of our evaluation, so we focused on the sample of courses that were intending to be full degree programs according to the authorization system in Georgia, rather than sort of shorter term certificate courses. So we looked at a total of 41 grant funded courses and did a tracer survey. So we surveyed all of the trainees who enrolled in these courses and then followed them 12 months after they graduated to measure their employment and earnings outcomes. So the end line surveys concluded in 2021. So it's important context here. It's about a third of the sample had their end line survey completed before the COVID-19 pandemic, and 2/3 were surveyed after the pandemic began. So that obviously had a depressing effect on employment across the board. And it's definitely something to keep in mind when you're looking at the results we'll be sharing. And in terms of the evaluation design, there wasn't a formal comparison group or any type of random assignment design, but we do benchmark the results of these graduates against a nationwide survey of TVET graduates conducted by the government of Georgia over the same time period. And this provides important context. But it's important to remember, this is not a rigorous comparison of an equivalent comparison group. The nationwide sample of TVET graduates generally includes lower level TVET courses where the entry requirements are lower and the participants are younger, the trainees are younger than the more educated, more higher level trainees who joined the programs that MCC funded. And that was deliberate. MCC wanted to create higher level, more technical training programs. And so part of what you'll see when we share the benchmarking results is different pool of trainees getting trained in different areas and how their outcomes differed from the existing TVET training programs and trainees. And we also conducted qualitative interviews with employers to try to look at some of those issues Marcel referenced about, are these graduates addressing an unmet need, and were they trained effectively for the jobs they hold? So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Evan, to discuss some of the results.
Great, thanks, Ira. My name is Evan Borkum. I'm a principal researcher at Mathematica, and excited to be sharing with you some of these initial results out of Georgia. So before I go through the results, just some additional context so you have a picture of these trainees in your head. So these trainees in the MCC funded courses, the vast majority of them are male. So there was an attempt to promote female engagement in these courses, but many of these courses are in very traditionally male disciplines like helicopter pilots, welders, and so on. And so this varied across the providers, but overall, the percentage of females was quite low. And as Ira alluded to, these are not trainees who are coming, straight out of high school at a young age and undergoing technical training. They're typically older, in their late 20s, and many of them have substantial work experience, including jobs that they held right before training. So a lot of this is people who are trying to basically upskill themselves to improve their career trajectory. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so these are our main employment results, and we measured employment in a couple of ways. The dark blue bars are, we looked at employment in this entire 12-month window since they finished the training. So did they hold any job in that window? And then the green bars are looking specifically at that exact point in time when we did the survey 12 months after graduation. So in the first couple of bars, the green bar is a bit lower because some people who found jobs in that window of 12 months subsequently lost them. But the big takeaway here is that there's a huge drop-off when you move from looking at employment in any job, which is the left-hand bars, to looking at employment in a job relevant to training, and even more so for a full-time job relevant to training. And so about half of the employment goes away if we change that definition, and that mirrors the results that my MCC colleagues were talking about earlier that have been seen in some other contexts. And so we see a lot of people essentially who tell us in the survey, we ask this explicit question, that they would have found their job without participating in this training, which is an inefficient outcome. Now this does vary across providers, so some providers do better than others, but this pattern is quite typical of relevant employment dropping off substantially relative to any employment. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to the audience, and we're going to try to do a poll. And so we asked these people who didn't find a relevant job why. What was the main reason that they didn't find a relevant job? And so I believe this is going to be open for about 30 seconds. So let's see if folks can guess as to what the main reason was that folks gave for not finding a relevant job. So I think this is going to be up for about 30 seconds, and then I assume this is just going to pop up when it's done. And then
this is where you do your song and dance interlude while we make time for people to answer the survey.
We're going to kill 30 seconds. There we are. Okay, so very interesting. The majority of you think that it's limited jobs available, and then also a substantial minority that people didn't have the necessary work experience or technical skills. So that's very interesting. Let's switch to the next slide, which is actually going to show the answer. And so the short answer is it's complicated. There's a wide variety of reasons, but we can think of these in two main buckets. And so the one bucket is supply side reasons, by which I mean trainees coming out of these courses just not being really available or interested in employment in their field. And that accounts for a surprisingly, at least to us, surprisingly large fraction of them. So this is more sort of the left hand and bottom side of the figure. And so reasons like I just wasn't interested in this field after training, I wasn't available because I was, say, in further training, or I joined the army, or some personal reasons, or that the pay was just too low to be attractive to me, actually accounted for about half of these people who didn't find jobs. And so about half of the people just didn't even search for a job in their field after they came out of the training. So supply side is a big part of this. And then there's also the demand side. So that's more classical reasons that I think people tended to think of. So the pandemic is one demand side constraint that certainly affected at least some of these sectors and that the training was in. And then also just generally people saying that there aren't jobs available and they lack the skills. Work experience was another big factor. So people saying that there may have been jobs out there, but not of someone with my experience profile was another factor. Now, most people did have work experience, but those who didn't seem to have struggled more to find jobs. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now onto the benchmarking. And so Ira was describing this. There are a lot of caveats to this analysis, but we're comparing the outcomes of our MCC funded courses to a broader set of courses in Georgia. And we split this analysis by pre-pandemic, so people who had their follow-up survey before the pandemic and post-pandemic. And so these are the post-pandemic results, and you can see that notwithstanding all these differences in sectors, levels, demographics, and so on, the employment rates, both in any job or in a relevant job, for the MCC funded courses are pretty much identical to those for a representative sample of courses in Georgia. So keep that in mind, and then we're going to go to the next slide, which is the post-pandemic cohorts. And what you can see here is that the MCC funded courses, which are the light and dark blue bars, those employment rates stay pretty constant for the pre and post-pandemic cohorts. But for the broader set of courses in Georgia, there's this drop off from the dark to the light green bars. And so there's this gap that emerges between the MCC sample and the benchmarking sample in the post-pandemic cohort. So there seems to have been a degree of resilience against the pandemic from these MCC funded courses, possibly because many of them were in sectors like IT, for example, which would be more pandemic resilient than some of the sectors that the other TVET courses in Georgia focused on. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, then we also tried to benchmark the wages. So I think it's best to focus on the gender bars, because wages in Georgia are quite different. There's a big wage gap for males and females, even within the same occupation. And so you can see that there is, again, many caveats to this analysis, but there is a gap in the right direction. So the MCC funded courses in the dark blue bars for both males and females, their wages are higher than for the benchmarking courses, but this gap, this gender gap persists, and that's what, again, my MCC colleagues were alluding to earlier. The courses, while there's suggestive evidence, at least here, that they improve wages, that gender gap was really not addressed in a meaningful way. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what to take away from all of this? So there is certainly some positive evidence of that MCC courses did well in terms of employment rates, especially for the post-pandemic cohorts, and in terms of wages. But the bottom line really is that there's still a large fraction of trainees who are not finding jobs in their field of training. The supply side issue seems to be a big issue here, of people, trainees really not carefully thinking about the course they're enrolling in, and perhaps not being screened in a rigorous way. So certainly in terms of policy, some sort of career guidance improvement there might help with that. And then also on the demand side, while there was this process to try and assert market demand, it may not have been particularly rigorous in some cases. And there is this issue in Georgia where employers, again, as MCC colleagues were referring to, employers are still not very engaged in the TVET sector as of now. So there are a few large employers, say in the energy sector, that are very, very much engaging with trainees regularly in terms of the training and hiring. But the smaller employers that are really the backbone of the Georgian economy are not doing that. And just as a final thought, there's a big move now to do that in Georgia, not directly related to the compact, but there is a new skills agency that's been established post-compact after these interventions that is trying to do exactly that, which is trying to really develop these umbrella bodies where smaller employers can be engaged directly with providers and better align their offerings to the employer's needs. And I will leave it there and hand back to MCC.
Excellent. All right, so what we're doing differently, so this is great. We kind of zoomed in closely to the Georgia case, and now we're going to look at kind of broaden back out at our broader lessons and see what we're doing differently, and we hope better. So Georgia was the first time we kind of really pivoted and put the private sector at the heart of the project, and asked for this co-contribution. And I think it's clear that these results are maybe not entirely what we were hoping for, but we kind of have done this better. But fundamentally, we didn't address the governance question, and so let's see where we go from there. So in Morocco, we identified a form of public-private training center that's government-owned and mostly government financed, but run by industry associations. And this means that the employers are essentially, making sure the training meets their own needs. And we'll come back to kind of how that affects the model and this accountability relationship. We also introduced a results-based financing approach to job placement services to train. The government was kind of paying lots of trainers to train people with the idea of getting them into jobs, but only paying for training. And so we kind of shifted the needle a little bit to make sure that we're actually paying when we get those placements. Next slide, please. So kind of what are our big picture lessons here? So number one is all the way to kind of the beginning, right? What's the precondition, right? Is TVET the right solution? Next slide. And the idea is that there really should be a demonstrated skills gap, as a precondition to investing in TVET. If the idea is, oh, there's lots of unemployment, skills may not be the right answer, job creation might be the right answer. But in the case where there are employers who are saying that they are not able to find people with the skills they need, TVET can be responsive to that and then could create jobs. Next slide. So the next lesson, we jump all the way to the right, and that's kind of keeping our eye on the ball. Next slide. And that TVET should have two primary goals. One is placing graduates in jobs with approved incomes and providing the private sector or employers with the skills that they need. And even if what you really care about is this first one, right? Graduates in jobs with incomes. If you're not also keeping in mind the second, you're likely to get neither. So the next is what we call this missing link, the employer accountability. And that's kind of strengthening the short route, lesson 3 along the bottom. And the idea is that if employers are actually also a client and an indispensable stakeholder in TVET, we need to find a way to provide client power, not just from job seekers, but also from employers. And so that's bringing them in. And one way to do this is this model that I talked about in Morocco, where essentially you've fused employers and providers, where employers really have that client power. I have there's an anecdote, but I remember talking to a CEO of an aeronautics kind of manufacturing cabling company, and he said, "Look, I'm a member of the board of this PPP training center. I took graduates, or I took trainees who are working on my line. I provided feedback to the center, and they immediately took it into account. But this government center over here that I can see from my office has never come to talk to me." So you really are creating that client power. Next slide. And the next is, right, the national governance matters, right? Kind of don't forget the long route. The long route is still important. And a couple points here. So strengthening those national systems, one kind of indispensable way to do this is through data to facilitate decision making. It's amazing how just about every country that I've worked in, they don't have a permanent quality tracer study system. They're essentially flying blind. They don't know whether their system is leading to employment outcomes. And then you can use that data for quality assurance. So national qualifications frameworks, competency-based approaches, other building blocks are important. Next slide. But part 2 of this lesson is, find a way to innovate the long route, especially if you can't find a way to kind of make that short route work. So results-based financing is one way of doing this, right? So typically the pact between policymakers and providers, money just flows regardless of results. Let's kind of create a drawbridge there, which says that payments are actually contingent on the outcomes of interest. So if you're able to measure employment rates or even kind of gender participation, that kind of helps make that pact more functional. Next, please. The last one is cross-cutting across the bottom is this importance of gender inclusion. As Evan mentioned, right? So we really tried in Georgia to do better with gender inclusion, but we just didn't quite get there. And it's hard, right? But challenge is literally our middle name, and so we try and take this on. Next slide. But the important lesson is TVET has an important role to play, but will not resolve pre-existing inequalities in the labor market alone. One thing we've just negotiated a new compact with the government of Kosovo last week. And as part of that compact, we're including within the energy sector, both a new training program that will have gender inclusion as a core tenet to make sure that we try and get to parity in gender participation in the training. But then also we have a component that looks at the demand side and employers and helps create a more conducive and inclusive workplace so that there's a full pathway for women to get through training and into jobs. Next slide. So at the end of the day, so what, right? So we think that while there are challenges in getting to good TVET results, by focusing on enhanced service delivery accountability, in particular, bringing employers into the model, a big global we can realize TVET's promise for growth and employment. And that is the end. We've run a little bit longer than we were hoping to. One thing, we wanted to tee up a question for everyone, but then open the floor. Did any of these lessons particularly resonate with you more than others? Here's that slide. Just while we think about this, tee up your questions or kind of jump in with, I think maybe we'll just do this where we don't have a huge group of participants, so I'm happy to have someone just grab the mic and maybe we'll take a question or two and then go to answers.
The strategy I've used in the past is to say I see a hand when I don't, but we do actually have a hand.
Kurt, please jump in.
Yeah, guys, this is Kurt Richter, Michigan State University. Love the presentation. I love seeing MCC work with Mathematica. You guys are both great institutions. However, what got me was 50% of the issues identified by participants are clearly on the supply side. It's not a supply side that's directly connected to lack of skills. One of our assumptions in all this work, and I'm a big fan of it, I'm not trying to be critical here, is our assumptions that if we train them, jobs will come. I guess I watched Field of Dreams too many times, but what you're saying is that is not the case. And so how do we take that head on and not just say, well, if we train them better or differently, things are going to change? Because if people are saying they're just not available for the work, we can't train them out of that problem. We can't train a solution for them into that. So what are your ideas around that?
I'll give a quick response there. I think, I think it's a big thing. I think, people who come from education training space say, oh, unemployment's a problem, like here's our solution. But I think in order for this to work, there needs to be a broader look that there need to be jobs and excess demand for skills, unmet demand for skills, in order for training to be the right solution. Or like you said, you train it and frankly, you only increase the social problems. You kick the can two years down the road, and now people have more skills and higher expectations, and then are more aggrieved at the end of that. Others want to jump in on that?
Yeah, so I think the career guidance aspect is definitely something that's been getting attention in Georgia from a policy perspective. Some of those initiatives were supported by MCC as part of the policy reform piece, but kind of didn't move forward. So basically, these potential trainees get voucher funding from the government to attend these courses. So they're not putting in, by and large, their own financial resources into this. They're spending their time for sure, but the barrier to just sign up for these courses is pretty low by and large. And so I think there's this. I might as well just sign up for this course and take it, even if I'm not super interested. And that's kind of the one of the issues that I think needs to be addressed moving forward. And career guidance is one way to do that. I mean, people should know what the salaries in these sectors are fundamentally. They shouldn't come out of the course and say, oh, suddenly the salaries for welders are low, I'm not interested. They should know that ahead of time so that they can make those informed decisions when they're thinking about what kind of training to undertake.
And I think eventually building those, real quick, I think eventually building accountability mechanisms into the system. So that's right. So that a training provider that's providing training and then, and doing it at a cost, potentially a high cost, but then no one wants to go into the jobs because the returns are so low. There should be pressures on that provider to do something different, right? To have a higher return on their investment. And that can either come from a client power via employers, or it can come from a government quality assurance, or that says, hey, if you're not actually getting to results, then we should stop funding this.
Just to build quickly on what Evan was saying, something we do see, this wasn't in the slides, but it's in the survey data, and we'll write this up in our full report. The employment placement outcomes were much stronger in Georgia for the trainees who had at least a few years of work experience before they entered the training program. So it's a sort of sign that if someone knew about the labor market and prevailing wages and knew they were interested in pursuing that career because they had already begun but just wanted a boost and earn a promotion or a more technical job in that field, the job placement outcomes look a lot better. So it's sort of a screening question about who comes into training.
Real quickly, how many people did you train in Georgia? What's your total population size, you think? And when people went through the program?
So it's 50 courses total. Do you know offhand, Evan, in terms of like a cohort size? So like in our sample, it's multiple cohorts per course, and the courses are still ongoing. So it's just, but in terms of annually, do you know what the enrollment looks like, Evan?
Yeah, I don't have the annual. All I know is that over 20 years, which is MCC's kind of time frame for cost benefit analyses, over 20 years, they're expecting about 25,000 graduates from these courses. So
just 25,000.
Do the math, but it's over a 20-year period. So a lot of these courses, I mean, they enroll twice a year, typically fall and spring. A lot of them, their enrollment is like say in the tens or something like that, because these courses require quite a lot of space and equipment and so on. And so it's, except for like the IT courses, you're not seeing huge enrollments by cohort. Often it's a few tens or even less than that per cohort.
Yeah, these were individual like trade courses. We didn't kind of invest in the entire an entire training center in Georgia. We did that elsewhere, but not in Georgia. A quick moderation note. So I think we're coming up on time. I think we're happy to stick around. I don't know if the system will shut us down or if we can stick around and continue the conversation. But maybe we'll keep trying. We'll keep trying.
One quick question over to Evan and Ira. There were a lot of sort of supplemental interventions around sort of quote unquote community of practice, or trying to look at how does one sort of change the directionality of TVET. Were there any of those that sort of stood out to the folks either in interviews or in key informant interviews, of things that really seemed to sort of either change the dialogue around governance or change the focus of providers?
Yes, I think definitely the new skills agency, which is really trying to engage the employers in a meaningful way in TVET governance, like Marcel was talking about. I mean, that cannot be attributed directly to the work you guys did, but at the same time, some of these ideas about public-private partnerships and engaging employers, certainly MCC helped to push those ideas out there. And there's a big movement in that direction. Quality assurance is the other big piece that people talk about. That everybody agrees that these courses are very high quality. Quality is not the reason why some of the employment rates are perhaps not quite what was expected. And so certainly, I'm not sure quite if I can't prove that that's changed public perceptions yet, but certainly the old view of this is a Soviet system where these courses are run down and low quality. That certainly should have changed, at least for these providers, given the emphasis on quality assurance.
Well, it looks like we're gonna have to shut the room down, or risk getting the music like the Oscars. The music will start playing, but thank you. Thanks to you guys, Evan, Ira from Mathematica, and thanks to USAID for hosting us, for pulling all this together, for everyone for organizing.
And there was the question in the chat for anyone. Please feel free to reach out directly to continue this conversation. We'd love to talk more either on the MCC or I think I can speak for the Mathematica side too.
Definitely.
Absolutely.